Salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala amma ba'd. We're continuing our journey through virtues on reciting the Quran. We're on Hadith number 3. This is a beautiful Hadith that continues the theme that we touched upon in the last session. This is a Hadith that's narrated by Abu Saeed al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, the great companion. And it's a Hadith that's authentic, yet it's not found in any of the books of Hadith, any of them. Neither the 6 books nor the 9 books. It's found in the early books of tafsir. So Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah, he narrates it with an authentic chain in his tafsir. And among the scholars that authenticated it from our times is Shaykh Nasiruddin al-Albani rahimahullah ta'ala. It's a hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, Kitabullahi huwa hablullahi al-mamdud min as-sama'i ila al-ard. Again, Kitabullahi huwa hablullahi al-mamdud min as-sama'i ila al-ard. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the book of Allah, it is the rope of Allah extended from the heavens to the earth. The book of Allah is the rope of Allah extending from the heavens to the earth. This hadith, as we mentioned, continues the same lesson from the last hadith. In the last session, we looked at the narration that mentioned that the Quran, part of it is being held by us, and part of it is being held by Allah's hand. It mentions that divine connection. This hadith continuing that theme of the Quran being the divine connection, and also it clarifies and explains that hadith in a more explicit way. And in this particular hadith, it uses a beautiful metaphor. The book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Allah's rope coming from the heavens to the earth. And this hadith is also explaining a verse of the Quran, and that's the function of all the narrations in the Sunnah in general, that it explains the Quran. The Quran is the base, the Sunnah is what explains it. And that verse is a verse that we all know from Surah Al-Imran, verse number 103. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا وكنتم على شفا حفرة من النار فأنقذكم منها كذلك يبين الله لكم آياته لعلكم تهتدون. Allah says, and hold fast to the rope of Allah, all of you together, and do not be divided. And remember the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon you, that He united your hearts. You were once enemies and He united your hearts. And you were standing at the brink of a precipice of fire, and He saved you from that fire and from that destruction. Thus Allah reveals and clarifies His signs to you so that you may attain guidance. So in this particular verse, this verse appears in a passage, in a context that's talking about the brotherhood of the believers. And in that middle of that passage, Allah is mentioning, hold fast unto the rope of Allah, and do not be disunited. Do not be divided. And then He mentions His favors upon the believers. Now, Allah mentions the rope of Allah. Hold onto the rope of Allah. What is the rope of Allah in this verse? The commentators have various opinions. Among the opinions and the views was that the rope of Allah refers to Allah's covenant, Ahdillahi ta'ala. And Imam al-Nawawi, he championed this view. Also Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, the Mufassir, championed this view. That Allah, when He talks about the rope of Allah, He's talking about Allah's covenant. Yani, He's talking about the covenant of Iman, faith. Among the views is that it refers to none other than the Quran. And that's what this hadith seems to support. And there are many narrations and many additional hadith of the Prophet that mention Hablullahi wal Quran. The rope of Allah is the Quran. And many companions narrated this view. Among the views is that it refers to Allah's religion. Holding onto the rope of Allah refers to the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His deen. Among the scholars that held this view was Imam al-Tabari himself, rahimahullah. And from our times, Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Sa'di and Shaykh Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, rahimahullah. Among the views is that it refers to al-Jama'ah, meaning the body of believers, the collective unity of the Muslims. So holding onto the rope of Allah is holding onto the unity of the Muslims. Among the views is that it refers to Tawheed. And there are other views, but these are the salient, the majority views on what it means when Allah mentions the rope of Allah in this context. And when you look at all of these views, the summary is that they're not really contradictory, they're complementary. We're all talking about the same essence. So whether you talk about Allah's religion, or you talk about the Quran, or Allah's covenant, yani Iman, we're talking about the same thing, because the Quran in essence is what defines our Iman and our covenant. The Quran is what spells out our covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran is the base of our religion, our deen. So whether you're talking about Allah's religion, Islam, covenant, or the Quran, we're all talking about pretty much the same thing. And perhaps when you look at the spirit of the verse and look in the context of the authentic narrations, it appears that the Quran being the rope of Allah seems to be the correct view and the one that's more consistent with the spirit of the verses, because Allah is talking about here, He's talking about holding fast to the rope of Allah as a tool of unity. And He's using a metaphor that's tangible. Hold on to something physical with your hands, like a rope. And out of all the things that are mentioned, Allah's covenant, Iman, religion, the most tangible thing among them is the Quran. So really, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that the rope of Allah here refers to the Quran based upon these authentic narrations and others. So what is Allah saying in this verse? He's saying, hold on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yani the Quran. And do not be disunited. Do not be divided with one another. And then he mentions the beautiful blessing of brotherhood, that Allah blessed the believers who were warring tribes. The Aus and the Khazraj were among the most warring tribes. You know, they were fighting for centuries before Islam came. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through this Quran, He united these hearts. And He's mentioned, وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. Allah says, remember the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His favor upon you, when He united all of these hearts together. And you were standing at the brink of a precipice of fire, meaning you were about to be destroyed, and Allah saved you from that. So in this context, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning the Quran as a tool of unity, as a tool of brotherhood. And in this context, we would also like to mention another hadith that kind of is related to all of this. It's a hadith from Sahih Muslim and the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, where it's a beautiful hadith where the Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Inna Allah yarda lakum thalatha. Inna Allah yarda lakum thalatha wa yaskhatu lakum thalatha. Verily Allah loves three things for you, and He hates three things for you. He loves three things for you, and He hates three things for you. يَرْضَى لَكُمْ أَن تَعْبُدُوهُ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. He loves for you, number one, that you worship Him exclusively and do not associate any partner with Him. وَأَن تَعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. And the second thing, He loves for you that you hold on to the rope of Allah and be not disunited. Be united with each other, holding on to the rope of Allah, yani the Quran. And the third thing, وَأَن تُنَاصِحُوا مَنْ وَاللَّهُ اللَّهُ أَمْرَكُمْ. And that you advise those who Allah appointed as leaders over you. That you continue to serve in the source of advisors and giving sincere advice to those who are entrusted with the responsibility over you. وَيَسْحَطُ لَكُمْ. And He hates for you three things. قِيلَ وَقَالَ وَإِضَاعَةَ الْمَالِ وَكَثْرَةَ السُّؤَالِ. He hates for you. قِيلَ وَقَالَ means vain talk, or talk that is not beneficial. Just talking about he said, she said. Literally means he said, she said. Or he said and it was said. Qila wa qal refers to that type of talk. Talking about things like, have you heard about what this guy said? Oh, have you heard what this guy's doing? Things that have no benefit whatsoever for us, whether it's in terms of our deen or our dunya. And when you look at the majority of things that appear on television and what people are involved in, that's what we're involved in for the most part. Most of the discourse that goes on, most of what's going on in Facebook, and although I'm not people know I've been on Facebook recently, and it's a great tool, and there's a lot of beneficial matters. But the majority of things you find on things like that and other social forums, things that have no consequential value. Things like this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm wearing, I'm hungry, and this is qila wal qal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He doesn't like for you. He's not talking about falsehood here. He's not talking about lying. He's not talking about those things that are haram. That's a whole different category. That's a crime. That's a sin. Here He's talking about qila wa qal, things that don't necessarily harm you, but they have no benefit for you. He said, she said, gossip. So Allah hates that. And the second thing that He hates, وَإِضَاعَةَ الْمَالِ, that you waste wealth, that you waste your money. And the third thing that He hates, كَثْرَةُ السُّؤَالِ, that you ask too many questions. And here we're not talking about religious questions, learning about the deen. We're talking about people who are critical, overly critical, always asking questions, not ready to accept something, but always digging deep into it, having that critical mind. So anyway, this is what this particular hadith says, and this is what this verse says, and this additional hadith. And I want to end with just taking a step back and looking at this rope analogy.